There's a crisis of death infecting the West right now. There are several countries, including the leader of these countries, like the Netherlands, that have actually legalized the ability of people to die with the express help of a physician. Canada, according to statistics, is actually catching up to the Netherlands in terms of their death count. As of 2022, Canada had 13,000 people marked as dead due to their physician-assisted suicide program. And unlike the United States, Canada actually allows you to go to a physician to get yourself killed regardless of the condition of your health. In the United States, you have to be terminal or at least a few months away from dying in order to even begin talking about this possibility. But in other countries, this is a rather accessible thing. Now, this culture of death, while in this video it'll be about euthanasia, has nothing to do solely with just euthanasia. This culture of death also has to do with the loss of moral values between people and their homeland, a disconnection between people, their homeland, and the history of their country, which then allows other people who have no respect for those countries, no respect for those people, to come in and rearrange their societies at a whim. So that is a different story, different day. So the death of moral sentiment is simply one category. But back to this euthanasia story. I was reading the Free Press and I came across this article, which is perhaps the most jarring article I have read in a very, very long time. I read some very jarring articles in my time, but this is perhaps one of the most. And it's titled, "I'm 28 and I'm scheduled to die in May." Now, this article details the story of a Dutch woman called Zara Tierbeck. I probably just butchered her name. I'm sorry, I'm not that good with Dutch. I don't know that language very well. And she has entered in a compact with the medical authorities of her country. The very same authorities that are supposed to help her and help her heal. They told her after numerous therapy sessions for issues she's had, this lady has borderline personality disorder, she has autism, she has depression, according to the article. They told her, and I quote, "There's nothing more we can do for you. It's never going to get any better." Her psychiatrist told her this, which then opened up the door for her to consider dying. So she has made an appointment with the Dutch government to have herself killed in her home in May. She's going to be at her couch. The doctor is going to administer her a sedative and then is going to administer her medicine, which will kill her in her sleep. And there is a process actually the Dutch government goes through to ensure this kind of practice happens according to their own standards. She said something that was quite interesting and quite telling in my opinion, that I think that everyone who is on either side of this debate should possibly look at. She said the following. She said, this is a matter of liberation for her. She said, "Where the tree of life stands for growth and new beginnings, my tree is the opposite. It is losing its leaves. It is dying. And once the tree has died, the bird flew out of it. I don't see my soul leaving, but more as myself being freed from life." Now, this is a very tragic circumstance. This is a very harrowing circumstance. But this circumstance, unfortunately, poses numerous moral, social, and philosophical questions for all of us to consider. Number one, it asks us to consider the relationship between normalizing certain behaviors and advocating for self-destruction. It asks us to consider the relationship between someone making a choice about the condition of their own life as opposed to people being groomed into wanting to end their own life. It asks us to consider the relationship between social moral neutrality on what someone else does in their own life and actually asserting oneself into that situation to prevent harm from happening. It asks us to consider a wide variety of things. I will only tackle a few of these questions the best I know how, because I believe they are indicative of a deeper problem that is happening in the hearts and minds of people across the West who are trying to grapple with the conditions of the new world, but they are not being given the machinery, the tools to do so. And therefore, in order to answer the moral question, when is advocacy destructive? When is normalization advocacy? When does social moral neutrality, as it relates to how people live their own lives, when should that have limits and when should it end for intervention? To answer any of these questions, does euthanasia violate the inalienability principle of life? We have to first consider the context in which these questions happen. When you have a society that deals with mental illness in a way that is not necessarily the best way, and there is not really an incentive to get rid of mental illness more so than there is to perpetuate and treat it, and there are other factors within that society that actually enable mental illness to flourish, that are outside of the medical system, that are not necessarily being addressed by that system or any other system, you have a recipe for disaster. It is a well-known fact that a lot of people, especially a lot of people in Gen Z, my generation, are suffering from reports of mental illness not seen in previous generations in the context of this new world, in the context of this overloaded, digitally saturated, non-focused world where the focus is more on the outside, what other people have, as opposed to what you have and what you can do with your life. I'm speaking obviously in broad generalities here, but this is very important to understand. And so you pair this social context with the medical context, the fact that there are indeed companies, there are indeed medical institutions that either profit or they have an incentive, whether it be through state involvement or some other ideological incentive, to enable people to go down certain paths and not to actually fix the core root of the problem they are having. You pair these two things together, you will get a generation of broken people whose brokenness are not being addressed. It's simply being entertained. It's being counseled. There's a difference between counseling something and solving something. When you counsel an issue, what do? You entertain the issue. You play with the issue. You explore the issue. But when counseling stops short of a solution, which is obviously should be its end goal, the issue remains. It's simply smoothed over and there's lipstick put on it so it can have a different appearance or a different relation to the person having the issue. Now, I believe that this lady who is going to undergo this procedure is existing within this context. In fact, the article itself suggests that she's existing within this context. And within this context, there is a sort of perversion of thinking. There is an inability to think clearly. And there is this drive to submit to the lowest possible answer that any of us can muster up. When I think of freedom, which is obviously, it's a value that I hold very dear. It's a value that I think characterizes the greatness of the West and separates the old world, which is a world characterized by status and familial bloodlines being the sum of your life and your value as a human being, with now this world of contract and this world of consent where human beings are presupposed to have value by the very virtue of their existence. And by virtue of that existence, they are expected to enter into social relationships and form bonds upon their own making. That has unlocked a kind of potential not seen in human history for a very long time. When I think about freedom, though, we have to really ask ourselves, is there a limit to freedom when it comes to how we treat ourselves? Euthanasia has been an issue that I have struggled with for a very, very long time, because I have almost always heard it within the context of people who are suffering with terminal illnesses who are going to die anyway, wanting to hasten their end. Within that context, for a very long time, I had few moral qualms. But when you really consider the broad nature of euthanasia, and you also consider just how much euthanasia has been sanctioned in certain countries by the government, and you consider that it happens more often than not in the context of a terminal situation, but in the context of mere desire and mere will wanting to end one's life, the moral universe around that issue fundamentally changes. Euthanasia is a Greek word. It comes from a Greek word that simply means a good death. That's what it means. And so this idea of having a good death is intuitively connected to alleviating suffering. But It also, in that same vein, can be connected with alleviating short-term suffering versus long-term suffering. And here's the issue. If someone is hooked up to a machine and they are in pain, and there is absolutely no possible way for them to be able to recover from their condition, it is terminal, we know this, and it's an established fact. Someone who decides to hasten their end is doing nothing that fate would not have done for them. In that sense, I don't see euthanasia as a matter of adding anything in that situation. It is simply hastening the inevitable. However, when the value of human life becomes contingent upon suffering in general in the short term, that is when this gets to be a very dangerous game. There's this idea that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's about the inalienability of rights, and the inalienability of life, rather. This is an idea that is deeply interwoven with the American system of government and politics. This is an idea that is deeply interwoven with the natural law tradition of the 18th century. This is an idea that is very, very prominent in a lot of Western thinking after the Enlightenment came about. And this idea says that life is so fundamental that not even you have the right to alienate it. Now, when you think of how the context you make moral decisions in, what is the number one requirement for you or I to make a moral decision? Life. We have to be living. We have to be living. If we're not living, we can't do anything. I can't speak to you like I am right now. I can't walk around. I can't do anything that would be a prerequisite for me to do a moral decision. So the moment we begin talking about alleviating suffering by terminating the fundamental principle that enables us to do a moral decision, that's the moment all moral decision making ceases. Because you're eliminating the requirement we need to even begin that conversation in the first place. In a society where neutrality is valued in terms of how people live their life, which is, by the way, a society that I support, neutrality has to have limits. Because if neutrality exists within a consortium of principles that are not neutral, but that are instead morally prescriptive. For example, you can't steal people's stuff. You can't lie to people in your contract. You can't defraud people. You can't do all that kind of stuff. Then you have to maintain the single principle that keeps the neutral structure up and running. And that principle is the principle of life. I see euthanasia in two ways. If someone is terminally ill, that constraining moral principle is already coming to an end. There's nothing anyone can do to fix that. This is not man playing God. This is man simply acknowledging, if you want to use that religious terminology. If you don't, excuse my language, but it's just going to be a way to address a popular conception. It's not man playing God. It's man accepting what God has put forth and simply wishing to bring it forth. That's a different situation. That is not categorically or morally the same as Canada saying, if you want to die, if you feel like if you can get up in life, we'll help you die. What that is, first of all, it fetishizes suffering, and it holds suffering to be a value over anything else, rather than acknowledging suffering as simply an integral part of the human condition. All the way going all the way to Prometheus and all of these different people. Prometheus and all these different stories, Jesus, all these different people. The human story is all about suffering. A more contemporary example, whether it be Solzhenitsyn or Dostoevsky or whatever they call his name, Dostoevsky. Suffering is also at the core there as well. Because when one suffers, they actually get to interact with the truest substance of life. When you are in a period of suffering, when you are in a period of let's say, desperation, you really begin to realize your limits because they're being thrust before you in a manner that a life of comfort does not bring them towards you. That's a prerequisite for growth. It's challenge, strife, travail, suffering. But when those things are seen as a prerequisite for ending any potential to grow, it suggests something about the quality or the value of life. It suggests something about the value of perseverance. It suggests something about all of these different principles that have come together to make civilization and human life possible. This culture of euthanasia that is not those edge cases I just talked about fundamentally challenges the foundation of how we see human value. And that is a problem. That is a huge problem. It is a moral problem, and it also is a social problem. Suicide is immoral because suicide seeks to terminate something that is fundamentally inalienable and without which no decision can be made. I don't care if that suicide is assisted by a physician or if it is done by yourself. The quality of the action still remains. And when this becomes a political assurance, when governments are sanctioning this, that then demonstrates a certain idea the government has about human life, human suffering. This girl that was in the story is not someone who's hopeless. She's not someone whose story can only be full of pain, nothing else. She is someone who is simply going through the travails of life, perhaps a little bit more enhanced in her case, because those travails come with the mental and sociological disorders that she happens to have. But she is not someone who is hopeless. But the fact that there is an entire institution built on doing no harm that seeks to cheapen the value of her life by saying she is hopeless and then assisting her in getting rid of it, as opposed to continuing to push against what seems to be insurmountable odds, just demonstrates these institutions have become fundamentally corrupt and they have deviated from their first principle aims. We cannot have moral neutrality when the very prerequisite for morality itself, life, is challenged and attacked. No, we cannot. We cannot normalize the attack of that principle without jeopardizing the existence of human civilization and the social context in which morals are intelligible. Because human beings obviously are social animals, and our morality cannot be shown in any other context except the interpersonal context. When you eliminate that, you eliminate the possibility for ethics, for good behavior, for flourishing. This is a very tough issue because a lot of people are going through a lot of different things. And sometimes the weight of life is just so heavy. And I don't seek to diminish that. I don't seek to minimize that. As someone himself who's dealt with depression in the past, and still does today even, I understand what the emotional travails can do. But I also understand that experience is not king. This is another philosophical problem that we face. A lot of people reduce their lives to their mere experiences, because experiences obviously are just these fleeting things that happen time and time again, and they have different qualities, different images, different states of being all the time. A lot of people will reduce their life to their mere experiences, and this can go two directions. This can go in the direction of hedonism, where they just try to experience pleasure over and over again, no matter how destructive it is, no matter how catastrophic it is towards other aspects of their life. Or it can go the other direction, where they embrace nihilism, where the only answer is that there is no answer, and if there is no answer, I get to make my own truth, and I get to imprint that truth upon the world, whether it be through going out and harming somebody or harming yourself. Those are the two extremes of reducing life to experience. But what if I told you life is more than just experience? What if I told you that trying to go beyond your own experience, trying to go beyond your own self and see the good in the world, or see all kind of other things in the world, is a pursuit that will enrich your life because it expands the limitations of your own life and supplements them with the experiences of other people and the world. When you are simply looking at your own little box and you cannot see beyond that box, you have tunnel vision, it becomes incredibly easy to justify all manner of self-destructive and crazy things. But when you look beyond your box, And you begin to enrich yourself with concepts and arguments and principles and all these different things you didn't have before. Well, you may still have your own little box, but there's a little bit of light seeping through that you can therefore use to have a different perspective. Why am I saying all this crazy philosophical stuff? You may ask. I'm saying it because what happens on the individual level ultimately has a civilizational impact. And while I am an individualist, I'm not someone who believes that man exists independent of a social context. And I'm not someone who is going to ignore the downstream consequences of certain individual behavior in the broader social context. Neutrality cannot happen when its fundamental principle that it requires to exist is challenged. At that point, neutrality must end and there must be an assertiveness directed towards its enemy. Normalization cannot happen and be separate from advocacy, when very simply, there are institutions that are advocating for this by way of making it so accessible, so easy, and giving people no hope and allowing people to be reduced to their own experiences. That's not just normalization, that's also advocacy. There cannot be any permissiveness of the elimination of one's life, because life is the only context in which morality can happen. And the only thing that would justify an elimination of that context by another human being would be if someone else tries to eliminate that same principle in you by trying to kill you. Then you have self-defense. But beyond that, you can't make moral decisions when the only context in which you have is eliminated for it. There are so many reasons why the hands-off approach to this issue does not work, but it also is fundamentally morally repugnant. Again, the people that are terminal and who are going to die anyway, that is a separate issue. And that's not even the most biggest issue right now. In California, it is legal to have a physician help you die if you are terminal. And guess how many deaths physician-assisted suicide takes in California? 0.3% of the population. In Canada, anyone, for any reason, can have their doctor kill them. And guess how many deaths that same practice takes in Canada? It's gone up towards upwards of 30% in the past years, from 2017 to 2022. How you treat these things matters, and it matters significantly. And it's my hope that us in the West, we will be brave enough, we will be courageous enough, and we will be forthright enough to recognize the importance of first principles to all these issues, and to not normalize the elimination of the only thing that really makes it possible for us to have these kind of conversations in the first place. To not buy into the delusion of personal autonomy without recognizing that when personal autonomy invalidates the personal, i.e. when it takes away the object of the personal, i.e. the individual, it can no longer be personal. It is now suicidal, which is now a different category. When we can recognize all these things, perhaps then we can have better issues with the suffering and problems of our lives. But until then, my friends, we can't permit this kind of behavior to happen. And in America, which thankfully does not have the same problem as the other countries do in terms of this issue, we should not let this be the testing ground for state-sanctioned, society-approved suicide. Because if we're going to be a country that stands on the inalienability of rights and the inviolability of life, then we ought to stand on that issue in every single context, whether suffering be the subject or not. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. I hope this video blessed you. I hope that it enlightened you. I hope this was a fair treatment of the subject. If you want to support me and help me keep this channel going, be sure to donate to me. Be sure to comment. Be sure to like, to subscribe. Tell me your thoughts about what I said. If you want to also help me keep the channel going in other ways, you can donate to me as well on PayPal, Patreon, all that kind of stuff. It's all in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.